Great. Well, it's really good to be here tonight. On behalf of the Armenian Studies program, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's spring lecture series presentation. This evening, we're taking a look at some of our upcoming events that are kind of scrolling through, and I want to just mention a couple of them with you so that you'll see what's coming up in the Armenian Studies program in the month of March. It'll come up after we take a look at this. We have several lectures, and they're all on Facebook, Twitter, website, so you can always know what's upcoming in our Armenian Studies program lecture series. Our banquet is coming up. This is our 34th annual banquet on Sunday, March the 20th. The program will be celebrating its 45th anniversary. This is with tickets. We'll be at the Fort Washington Country Club in Fresno. A very special concert on Saturday, April the 2nd will be Boris Alaferdian, who is the principal clarinet at the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra, and he's bringing his wife, Aline, who also plays piano, so together they'll be doing that, and that's kind of the upcoming events. So let's go on from there. So once again, good evening, everyone. You may not realize it, but it was about March 13th of 2020 when the pandemic kind of shut down the state of California and the United States, and that was our last time before March 2 years ago when we had an in-person event. So even though we have just a few people here, it's just to tell us that we're going to get back together soon, and so I'm very happy to have all of you here this evening. This evening, our guest is Dr. Suren Manukian, who's traveled all the way from Armenia to be here. Last semester, he was the Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State and taught a course on genocide. He is the head of the UNESCO Chair of Prevention of Genocide and Other Atrocity Crimes at Yerevan State University. And Yerevan State University is the premier public institution in Armenia. He is also the head of the Department of Comparative Genocide Studies at the Armenian Genocide Museum. The Armenian Genocide Museum is associated where the Armenian Genocide Monument is located, Zizer Nagapert, and also is also a research institution. He has frequently been in the United States, and he's also been a Fulbright Scholar at Rutgers University, where he was a Fulbright Scholar for the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. This evening, he is going to outline for us his research on the most recent innovations and where the field of genocide studies is going. And we're not just talking about Armenian genocide studies, we're talking about the general field of genocide studies. And what he will be bringing to us is the idea of how this once small topic, once small area has now transformed into a worldwide area of study. That is, there are people from all over the world now studying genocide as a field of study. And so he's going to talk about this very dynamic and growing field. And then he will point out to us some of the more innovative areas where research is headed, what we know, and what we don't know in genocide studies. And in doing so, he'll be giving us a very interesting presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Suren Manukian. Dr. Manukian.
Thank you, Professor Manukian, for this kind introduction and having me here today, and for this opportunity to share my ideas, my findings of my research. My first talk at Fresno State was 9 years ago, and today I'm going to present what happened in these 9 years what are the directions that genocide studies is going forward. And my first, of course, starting from the title of my presentation, my first reservation is about the world new, because we must remember that genocide studies is relatively young academic field, and it actually has only approximately 40 years of life, and the basic vocabulary and research methods that are becoming canonic for this branch of sciences are still in the process of construction. So this new is not so clear and established in the case of genocide studies. And today I will very briefly make an introduction of the history of the establishment of this field, and then we will discuss some main trends, some main developments, some current developments of the field. Another clarification should be made that the phenomenon of genocide has accompanied humanity for centuries. And we can argue that the genocide, the phenomenon of the genocide is maybe as old as civilization itself. The many ancient cases of disappeared peoples and cultures may not always point to genocide, but I'm speaking today about the new developments and trends, so the reinvention of his writings, his activity of his life is one of the most, let's say, fashionable topic in genocide studies. But at the same time, we should remember that yes, Genocide Convention was adopted in 1948, but it remained, it was not enforced for many years. It remained on paper, and many incidents in the world fitted to the Genocide Convention, among them mass killings in Cambodia, when from 1975 to 1979, about 1.7 million Cambodians, Vietnamese, Chinese, Muslim people of the Cambodia were exterminated. Also killings of indigenous population in Paraguay, in Argentina, killings in Bangladesh, genocide in Bangladesh. Political killings in Indonesia happened, but the term was forgotten and had never been enforced. The explanation is the Cold War. It started almost immediately after the adoption of the Genocide Convention, and the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, split the world into two camps and used to cover up their allies' crimes. It would have been almost impossible for the international community to investigate these crimes and take action if the massacres happened in the state under their protection. For example, the perpetration of the Cambodian genocide, the perpetrators of Cambodian genocide, the regime of Red Khmers or Khmer Rouge, was beneficial to the United States for their anti-Vietnamese rhetoric and policies, and the United States prevented any action against them in the international arena. Paradoxically, but when in 1979 the Vietnamese army overthrew genocidal regime of Pol Pot, the regime that was the cause of the deaths of more than 1.5 million people, Vietnam was condemned by the United Nations until 1994. The Khmer Rouge genocidal regime was recognized by the United Nations and the legitimate government of Cambodia. And so let's come to the political field and to the academic field. And the topic of genocide was also overlooked in the academic field for a long time. In the 1970s, it was just a narrow professional interest for a group of scientists. Therefore, it would be correct to start the history of creation of the field from 1970s, the end of 1970s and beginning of 1980s, when several scholars at the exact time endeavored to study the genocide from different perspectives and made it subject of teaching. We call them founding fathers of genocide studies, although among them there is a woman, Helen Fine, but it's just a term that is very common for genocide scholars. And among them, Leo Cooper, a professor of sociology from the UCLA, Helen Fine, who headed New York Institute for Study of Genocide, Professor Israel Charny, a prominent scholar who also had a great contribution in involvement of Armenian genocide in this field of genocide studies, and Irving Louis Horowitz, who published a great amount of literature on the Armenian, on the genocide studies. And later in mid-1980s, other scholars joined this list. And initially, these scholars focused on the term genocide. It was clear to everyone that the UN Genocide Convention of 1948 is imperfect and has many flaws. And almost every scholar tried to offer their own definition of the genocide phenomenon. Genocide scholars of the first generations also concentrated on the causes of genocide, trying to look out this most common causes for genocide, and also they focused on the study of the history of various genocidal cases and trying to discover prescriptions for its prevention. Indeed, it can be argued that without their pioneering efforts and the efforts of the scholars who followed shortly thereafter, it is probably that the field of genocide studies would never have developed. They presented papers at conferences hosted by the respective disciplines or universities, organized the first conferences dedicated to the subject of genocide, wrote the first books on genocide, developed the first research tools, and also they created the first institutes and organizations to research genocide. They tried to define the boundaries of genocide study, because there is a funny story. Then in 1983, Professor Herb Hirsch decided to organize a panel for a meeting of the American Political Studies Association in Chicago. The committee in charge of organizing the meeting did not have any idea where to place the panel because it did not fit their regular categories. No one knew the specification of the topics. So even the boundaries, the limits of this field were very blurred. Yes, we should mention that many from the founding fathers had a direct connection to genocide through the Holocaust or Armenian genocide, because they were either Armenians or Jews, and other came to the field more indirectly through the experience of the 1960s, the civil rights movements and human rights activists. The Armenian genocide evolved part of genocide studies in the early 1980s when Israel Charny in 1992 organized an international conference in Tel Aviv. And it's very interesting. There is a very interesting story behind this conference because Turkey tried to spoiled the organization of this conference, and after long debates and resistance of Turkish embassy, papers of the Armenian genocide were also included in the program of this conference. And thanks to this Turkish denial, Armenian genocide became the part of the genocide studies. Genocide studies, but anyway, in 1980s it was a small, narrow topic with a very limited number of scholars who were interested in this subject, with a very, very few books published not in prime publishing houses. And genocide studies have expanded rapidly since the mid-1990s. For many reasons. The first was the end of Cold War, and here you can see the people celebrating near the Berlin Wall. And when the Cold War was over, there was hope that the world would henceforth function as a united body, and the UN conventions, including Genocide Convention, will no longer remain only on paper. However, expectations were not met, and the decline of Soviet Union, the decline and the Soviet influence in Africa, the Velvet Revolutions and in Eastern Europe, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and the creation of new states reveals many previously hidden conflicts that were once concealed by Cold War logic, but they came to light. Moreover, humanity witnessed new massacres, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In 1994, the members of Hutu majority in Rwanda organized genocide and against the Tutsi minority, and killing over 800,000 people in 100 days. In 1991, 1999, war crimes against humanity, and genocides took place in the territory of former Yugoslavia, including 1995 massacre of Bosnian Muslim men in Srebrenica, which was later considered as genocide by international court. And the events in Yugoslavia and in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the creation of international tribunals to investigate these genocides, and the continuous and the creation of International Criminal Court, and it was enforced from 2002. All these developments brought public attention to the phenomenon of genocide. And during this time, scientific organizations, museums, and university programs dedicated to the study of the crime of genocide emerged and developed. The field of genocide studies has its own professional organizations and journals. The genocide conferences became regular events. A new generation of genocide scholars is beginning to contribute to the field while also engaging in debates over critical issues with the founding fathers. Genocide studies has come a long way over the past decade, having attained a level of intellectual sobriety, academic credibility, and public recognition virtually inconceivable 40 years ago. Universities around the world feature it in their curricula and host genocide studies centers. Monographs anthologies and encyclopedias on the subject were published by the leading university presses. Now, this is very briefly about the history of creation of the field. Now, let's zoom on some most important developments. The first thing I wanted to start is the debates around the comparative genocide. The comparative study of genocide is one of the most stimulating methods of genocide studies. It underwent sometimes on the explosion in the first decade of the 21st century, and a raft of excellent contributions appeared, both theoretically sophisticated and thematically diverse. It developed in response to the thesis of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Some words about the thesis of uniqueness of Holocaust. The Holocaust was seen as a new reality, an unprecedented event in human history that did not fit into existing definitions. Even the concept of genocide, which Raphael Lemkin designed to describe the policy of extermination of the Jews during the Second World War, was considered for some radical Holocaust scholars inconsistent with the Holocaust and was incapable of fully illustrating it. The issue of uniqueness was sort of consensus in treatment of the Holocaust. What became fixed in the collective awareness, mainly among Jews, was the message conveyed by the survivors that it was a different planet. The phrase by writer Yehiel Demur with regard to Auschwitz during his testimony at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in June 1961. And Elie Wiesel, too, made a major contribution to the conversion of the Holocaust into an event with metaphysical sanctity, an event that exists beyond time and place, when he wrote, "I always forbade myself to compare the Holocaust of European Judaism to events which are foreign to it. Auschwitz was something else, the universe of concentration camps, by its dimensions and its design lies outside, if not beyond history. Its vocabulary belongs to it alone." The scholars who studied the Holocaust based on the axiom that the dimensions of the Holocaust are so unique that they cannot be compared to any other phenomenon. Moreover, they stated that a new discipline was needed to describe or study the Holocaust exclusively. The idea for uniqueness also formed barriers to studying the Holocaust itself, preventing it from becoming a subject for broader comparison with other genocides. And recently, the provision of uniqueness has undergone some revision. Other genocides get their rightful place in curricula and research. However, in all cases, the phrase Holocaust and genocide studies kept in many academic institutions and centers, and I think it forms a false agenda according to which the Holocaust is more than any other genocide and needs recognition of extra status. From the claim to uniqueness, though the claim to uniqueness has been a bit discredited, the theory of exceptionality has replaced to it, a stance embodied and institutionalized in the fast-growing Holocaust and genocide motive, which by resting in case of exceptionalism encourages the concepts of apartness and exclusivity. Moreover, even Holocaust scholars who agree to conduct comparative studies continue to view the Holocaust as a major center of gravity and the study of other genocides as subordinate or younger study. scholars must avoid a too narrow grasp of genocide. And I agree with Jacques Semelin, who calls it an ethnoization of genocide studies. Too much of this kind of scholarship encourages the emotional fall into victimology and exaggerated assessments, which at times can lead to flawed and even anti-intellectual conclusion. Now, the Armenian genocide, Rwandan genocide, and the Holocaust are free of the common case of comparison in the comparative literature of genocide. Yet in terms of the historical period, region, territory, economy, demographic structure, and even the nature of the violence, these cases of course differ dramatically, and if one of them unique, they are all unique. Each of them are unique. And let me just bring two, I think, very important books on the comparative study. One of the first book is the first and truly comparative studies was published in 1992 by Robert Melson, a political scientist and Africanist by training. Melson compared the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide underlying the common elements of ideology, revolution, and war. The differences between the two cases, however, were as important. And there is another attempt to compare Armenian genocide and Rwandan genocide, the book of Deborah Meyerson about some common points and some specific features of these two genocides. The next trend, or the next point I wanted to mention, it is this shift from macro history to micro history. Genocide studies started from macro histories. The macro level refers to interstate structures and the context of geopolitical power relations. It makes sense because genocide is usually a top-down process in which national states are initiators and authorizers of mass violence. Theorizing position of at the micro level is a natural fit for genocide studies. The founders of genocide studies attempted to develop a comprehensive narrative that would illustrate the complete history of the different genocide chronologically and thoroughly. It was very important. They tried to create the big narratives, the big pictures of genocide, and they tried to write histories of genocides. And in the first stages, in the initial stages of genocide studies, we meet these comprehensive volumes describing the whole histories of genocide. At the same time, the dynamism at the macro level should not overshadow important research agendas at the micro or local levels. Nowadays, more and more works are written where general narratives have been replaced by local studies, which enrich topic and allow to understand the phenomenon in its entirety. As Scott Strauss has noted, it increases the number of observations available for study, allowing for more nuanced understandings of violent dynamics than those found in macro-level studies, and it decenters our general descriptions of violent phenomena. Local actors transmit and sometimes initiate policies to commit violence, identify and sort victims, and frequently are key perpetrators of actual killings. Local actors' actions can shape, amplify, and inhibit agency and victimization. By looking carefully at the micro level, scholars can develop a richer understanding of the dynamics of violence and generate evidence by which to evaluate competing hypotheses. And it's very important because we should remember that genocide is something that is implemented by human beings, by ordinary human beings like me and you, like common people you meet every day in your life. And that's why when we try to impersonalize the genocide and try to describe genocide through this abstract construction like geopolitical developments, like shifts of power, we can overlook the real actors, the main actors and main perpetrators of genocide. One of such trends is to picture the genocide process by the case studies of different cities and provinces. And in this photo you can see the picture of Tigranakert, one of the cities then Armenians were totally exterminated in the time of Armenian genocide. And examples are studies of, let me bring some examples of such books. For example, books on the Diyarbakir region, the books of Hilmar Kaiser and Ugurungur on the genocide in the province of Diyarbakir. In the genocide in one local ground, in one local space. The study of Umitkurt on Aintab, again the example of extermination of population, the fate of Armenian population in one local space in province of Aintab. And the book of Bahram Shemaisan on Musadak. Again, a sort of anthropology of place, anthropology of one dwelling, one settlement. Paradoxically, but I can also stress on the book of Raymond Gevorkyan in this list. It is extensive work, extensive volume with the ambitious title of Armenian Genocide, A Complete History, but it's very close to this genre of micro-histories, because it's first attempted to study the Armenian genocide from the perspective of Ottoman domestic policy, while such comprehensive narrations focus mainly on the geopolitical development of the event. And Gevorkyan presents the process of the genocide in separate provinces and even smaller units, mentioning specific features and dynamics in each of them. In terms of restoring the anthropology of different settlements, also we have this series of produced by Richard Hovhannisyan and Hushamadian project in the internet. But again, remember that it's not just a specific feature of Armenian genocide studies, but also in different other genocides. Now we see the shift of focus from macro history to micro histories, to histories of specific places. Genocide in one village, genocide in one province. And this is a beautiful book, a very well written and researched project of Omer Barta, prominent Holocaust scholar, and he tried to write the history of the settlement of the village of his parents. And this is the story of this small village in East Urebushchat, and again, very beautiful case of microhistory. Also, examples of microhistories can be found in specific case studies of, for example, the book of Petros Telmatosyan just came out. It's a book about the pre-genocidal killing in Adana. And also another type of such studies is the research of the individuals. When authors try to understand how individual perpetrators participated, became involved in this genocidal process, either as perpetrators, victims, or third parties. And studies of individual perpetrators have also been neglected for a long time, but now it's another very important field of research in recent years. And one of the examples of book of Hans Lucas Kizer on the Talat Pasha, and named Father of Modern Turkey, Architect of Genocide. Yes, so micro-level research is a promising emerging research area concentrating on the local level where national level policies and decisions translate into individual actions on the ground will provide the field with a better understanding of causal chains and mechanisms. Another thing I wanted to stress, it is the interdisciplinary or even multidisciplinary field of genocide studies. It's again, it's not new, but now more and more studies are a result of cooperation between scholars from came to genocide studies, to the field of genocide studies from different fields, it's interesting, since the Second World War, especially most disciplines have engaged in increasingly narrow specialization. Genocide studies has become increasingly holistic, much more generalist than specialist. And let's take a look on this scheme. You can see that genocide is about history, of course, because we try to finding examples, cases to analyze different aspects of genocide from historical cases. Genocide is about law, it's about legal matters, because genocide convention is a legal document. Genocide is sociology, because, as I told, it is human being who kills another human being. And it's also psychology, because we try to understand how it's possible that human being, ordinary citizen, ordinary human being, transforms into killer and mass murder, mass killer. Genocide studies, it's about representation of what happened in literature, in philosophy, trying to understand, to comprehend what happened. It is also a very, it's gigantic economic project, and to understand the implementation of genocide, to understand all these forces those drive the state and society to genocide. We should research also economic causes and economic consequences. And of course, genocide is political science. It took some insights from political science, because genocide is first of all political crime, and they are political actors who organize, who are behind the very project of genocide. So genocide scholars draw on insight from history, sociology, political science, psychology, and their own work finds readers in those disciplines. And all these fields are closely related, and today we see a lot of examples of this cooperation, of these projects implemented as a result of coordination and collaboration of these scholars from different fields. Another very important new development, of genocide studies, it is the very interesting and newly emerging topic of colonial genocides. Although genocide research is conducted worldwide, the field is still dominated by Eurocentric attitudes and approaches. Genocide is commonly understood as a phenomenon that can only occur either in totalitarian regimes or in failing states in the so-called third world. According to this assumption, the best way to prevent mass violence would be the global spread of Western-style liberalism, capitalism, and democracy. And the Australian historian Dirk Moses has subsumed these ideas under the term liberal theory of genocide. And this concept is closely linked to modernization theory and to Francis Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history, since the Western way of development is regarded as the only path that can lead to peace, prosperity, and international security, or in other words, to a world without genocide. As a consequence, adherents of the liberal theory of genocide see Western democracy as a kind of redeeming power that had to prevent or stop genocidal violence once it occurs in societies that lack democratic institutions and Western ideas of human rights. Of course, this does not mean that the West is perfect or without guilt, and Western support of dubious dictatorial and anti-communist regimes in Latin America and Africa during the period of Cold War is now regarded as a moral mistake, and that ineffectual international reactions to the genocide in Rwanda and the wars in the former Yugoslavia are regarded as sins of omission. But the idea that Western democracies could themselves become perpetrators of mass violence contradicts the worldview of the liberal theory of genocide and is therefore rejected. And in recent years, several historians have started to question the bias of the liberal theory of genocide studies and to examine the genocidal outcomes associated with the rise of the West. Although some scholars of mass violence still feel uneasy about the term colonial genocides, many cases of imperial violence have been thoroughly researched recently. And I want to bring an example of the book of Andrew Woolford, professor of University of Manitoba in Canada, about the residential schools. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools established to assimilate indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture, and originally conceived by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert indigenous youth and to integrate them into Canadian society. Residential schools disrupted lives and communities, causing long-term problems among indigenous people. And the last residential school, by the way, closed in 1996. And now there is a growing interest in massacres of genocidal proportion in the context of colonization, and it becomes clear that racist policies in the colonial empires frequently subjected the indigenous population to existential dangers. This calls for more systematic examination by the new generation of scholars, but there is a further side of these post-colonial mass killings. The next thing I want to introduce, it is the issue of prevention. An important feature of genocide studies over the last 20 years has been an increased emphasis on applying academic theories to preventing genocide. This is quote of Israel Charney, who compare genocide scholars, genocide scientists, to doctors, to genocide doctors who are involved in healing, treating, and preventing. It's very common view since late 1990s, and because there have been various attempts to establish early warning mechanism capable of recognizing potential genocidal situations from the number of variables. And the most famous, the most well-known is this model of Barbara Harf and Ted Gur, which uses 6 key variables, among many others, to predict genocide: degree of political conflict, existence of previous genocide, ideology of ruling elite, regime type, ethnic situation, and openness to trade. For over 2 decades, various scholars, and particularly first-generation genocide scholars, have talked about the need for and value of genocide early warning signals and genocide early warning systems. Both the United Nations and individual states, including the US, also addressed the need for the genocide early warning system, and have actually put in great amount of time, thought, and energy toward developing one, but such a system remains more of an idea than reality. Some have suggested that reports by journalists could more or less serve as early warning signals, while some have, it is also a fact that journalists are neither trained to decipher potential early warning signals, nor in the business of doing so. It is also a fact that journalists must judge and must interpret an outbreak of violence. That is not surprising, nor it is an indictment of them. That said, with their expertise and abiding interest, genocide scholars could serve the double duty of monitoring conflicts and accelerating the decision-making process to stop genocide and halt violence in these or that regions. And maybe the last development and the last debate, the last topic in which we have 2 groups of scholars in genocide studies, and we have the most debatable discussion, the most debatable things in the field. The topic of activism. The topic became part of politics as genocide scholars, after failures in Rwanda and Bosnia, became more determined to make the slogan of genocide prevention, the slogan of never again, a reality. This mission could not be said to have been successful, but at the same time, it gave rise to the whole system that incorporated legal and social mechanism of prevention, which became particularly visible in 2003 with the example of efforts to combat genocide in Sudan's Darfur province. The topic of active involvement, when scholars, besides of study of genocide, participate in co-authoring resolutions calling for international community to act to stanch contemporary crimes against humanity, signing resolutions, writing editorials about governmental and intergovernmental actions and inactions during periods of crimes against humanity and genocide, speaking at rallies and anti-genocide conferences, is in the center of 4 hot debates. Such scholars have been criticized by other genocide scholars for their activism. The former claim that scholars who engage in activism around the issue of genocide automatically call into question the validity of their scholarship. Another group of genocide scholars who are vitally concerned with the activism in prevention of and intervention in genocide cannot disentangle their activism from their scholarship. One has to wonder how an individual can work in the field of genocide studies and not be vitally concerned with preventing genocide, and when crimes against humanity are about or do actually erupt, avoid at all costs registering one's dismay and concern, and avoid issuing criticism if the international community does not act to stanch such atrocities in a timely and effective manner. Lemkin himself never acted as pure academician. It was an example of successful activism that brought to adoption of Genocide Convention. For this point of view, we must accept that the work of the International Association of Genocide Scholars fit perfectly into Lemkin's vision. Thus, the organization regularly makes a statement about current developments and resolutions. Many of the members are involved in various political and social initiatives to prevent genocide. And yes, and the last development of genocide research, of genocide study, it is the shift of focus from perpetrators to victims. The study of genocide started down as a study of perpetrators and collaborators, while the testimony of victims and survivors, except insofar as they lend color to the narrative, need not be taken into account. There were scholars who have argued that victim and survivor testimony is deeply flawed and should be avoided in historical explanations. Such scholars purposely avoid basing their analysis on victim and survivor accounts or even referring to them. For example, Raoul Hilberg, one of the most prominent Holocaust scholars who wrote monumental, fundamental work on the history of Holocaust European Jewry, his analysis of victim and survivor motivation and behavior will not do, but more importantly, by neglecting victims' testimonies. His perspective, methodology, and choices limit what he can say about German behavior, the subject of his study. For instance, Hilberg can neither describe nor document the excesses of cruelty practiced by perpetrators of the roundups, transport, and killing operations. But such excesses against women and children in particular need to be documented and explained. Why, if the perpetrators wanted to destroy the Jews, did they not simply kill them? Why did they expend so much seemingly unnecessary effort in torturing and humiliating their victims, often going behind their police and military orders? What ideological and of needs did such excess cruelty satisfy? Such questions are most likely to arise from victims, survivors' testimonies, not from the self-serving documents and testimonies of the perpetrators. With such notable exceptions, more Holocaust and genocide scholars have followed Hilberg's path. But the argument is not that genocide studies should be based only on victims' testimonies. No, but we should integrate the testimonies of victims and survivors into our accounts, in part of better understand the motives and behavior of the perpetrators. both also to give victims and survivors a voice in the narrative of destruction, a voice that the perpetrators intended to silence. Finally, genocide is not only about killing people. It is also about seizing their property, destroying their culture, denying their memories, and silencing them. In the Armenian genocide case, there is another reason for this neglection of survivors and victims' voice. Yes, by the way, in this photo, it's very interesting photo, because in this photo we can see at the same time perpetrators in the same photo and victims. And if we have volumes of literature about perpetrators, and we have even network of perpetrator scholars perpetrator research, but this group of people, victims, the main objects, targets of genocide were forgotten for decades. In Armenian genocide case, we have another reason. For a long time, Armenian documents, newspaper articles, or survivors' memoirs were overlooked in the study of genocide because of Turkish denial that labeled them as biased, and consequently, many Armenian authors preferred to avoid using Armenian sources to avoid these accusations, to avoid the accusations of survivor bias. Vagan Daderem, for example, one of the founders of Armenian genocide scholarship, tried to diminish the use of not only Armenian, but also documents from the Russian, British, and French archives, because they were enemies of Ottoman Empire in the First World War. And in addition, it has long been considered that Armenian sources, and not only Armenian, but sources of victims cannot constitute valuable or reliable historical documents because of their lack of objectivity, being written by members of this victim group. But recently, the situation has changed, and the unexplored memoirs kept for decades are gaining new life. And for example, again, let me bring the example of Armenian case. The Armenian material is beginning to be included in research to a greater extent. In 2012, the National Archives of Armenia issued a free-volume collection of our witnesses' accounts of more than 600 genocide survivors written in 1916. The American Shoah Foundation began digitizing the memoirs of Armenian genocide survivors. The Armenian Genocide Museum Institute has commenced publishing the samples of the extensive archive of memoir presenting in its archive. So these were the last changes, the last developments in genocide studies, the development of comparative genocide study, and more genocide scholars are involving in the International Association of Genocide Scholars. They are involving in comparative genocide research. The change of focus from big narratives, from macro histories to local research, to local study, to study of specific province, even city. The usage of immense usage of victims, memoirs, accounts of survivors, the targeted groups of people. Also, the new developments of attempts to create the comprehensive model for prevention of genocide, and debate around possibility of involvement of genocide scholars in this activism going behind they're going out of their offices and writing their volumes of books and participation in these public campaigns and trying to prevent genocide on ground. While genocide research has become an established academic discipline in the United States, and the pioneers of the field were from the United States. They shared the same language, the same academic socialization, the same political culture. Research was set in the political arena and framework of reference of the United States and American society. In new generation of genocide scholars in a globalized field, this is no longer sustainable. Academic traditions differ from country to country now. Economic points of references vary considerably. There are yet no global landscape of memory. If for scholars of the first generation after Lemkin, the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide were the defining experience, family experience, the political awakening of the younger generation might have been triggered by the killing fields in Cambodia, the genocide in Rwanda, or even the current acts of genocidal violence in Darfur, more than from the Armenian genocide and Holocaust. Furthermore, genocide means different things to different people now. Now, genocide studies turned into global affairs by having gained an institutional foothold on all continents. Now, it has become more intercultural. Works are now being published not only in English, but in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, in Russian, in Bosnian, in Armenian, in Serbo-Croatian. And today, generations of scientists are changing. New research tools are being introduced, new topics are being raised. All the research is being redrafted. And 40 years after the appearance of the field of genocide studies, we can appreciate how far it has reached from the interest of a small group of individuals to an academic domain with hundreds of scholars, thousands of students, and one of the most attractive and dynamically developing social disciplines. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Manukian, for this very interesting presentation. And you can just stay up here. We'll be probably taking some questions. I think it was a very comprehensive overview of the history of the field, which was quite